A drunk bully cornered a 74-year-old widow inside a Tim Hortons in Millhaven, Ontario, grabbed her coffee, poured it on the table in front of her, and told her to get out because her kind didn't belong there. The whole restaurant went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. He laughed. He thought he was untouchable in this small town, where his family had run things for 3 generations. He thought the old woman was alone. He had no idea her son was a Navy SEAL who had just pulled into the parking lot with his military-trained German Shepherd and was walking through that door right now. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, please subscribe. There are more coming. The last week of September in Millhaven feels like the whole world is trying to hold on to something it knows is leaving. The maples along Highway 33 go red and gold all at once, like they're putting on one final show before the cold comes. The air smells like wood smoke and lake water. The light, even at noon, sits low on the horizon and turns everything amber. Adele Mercer had always loved this time of year. 74 years old, white hair cut short and practical, hands that showed every decade of the life she'd lived. She'd raised 2 children in Millhaven after her husband passed. She'd stayed because leaving had never made sense. Her roots were here, deep and quiet, the way roots always are. Her son Cole had bought the old Whitfield property on the edge of Bayview Road the previous spring. A modest house with a wide porch and a view of the water. He'd bought it for her. Really, a place to come home to between deployments. A place where she wouldn't have to rattle around alone in the too big house on Elm Street. She'd resisted at first. Then she'd seen the porch. Then she'd said yes. Cole was on leave. 2 weeks, which in his world was an eternity. He'd driven up from Trenton that morning with Kodiak riding in the back of his truck. A German Shepherd, black and tan, with a stillness about him that made people instinctively lower their voices. Kodiak had served 2 tours. He was retired now, technically. But some instincts don't retire. Adele had gone into town ahead of him to pick up a few things. She liked the Tim Hortons on Main Street. She'd been going there since it opened. She knew the girl behind the counter. Petra, early 20s, quick smile, dark braid down her back. She always saved Adele the window seat when she could. That morning, the seat was waiting. Adele ordered her usual, a medium double-double, a blueberry muffin, and sat down with her library book. The place was busy. A table of retired men near the door talked hockey. A young mother tried to negotiate with a toddler about Timbits. The morning light came through the window and made everything look simple and good. She didn't notice Dale Fitch until he was already talking. Dale Fitch was 51 years old and built like a man who'd done hard physical work in his 20s. And stopped entirely in his 30s. He was the kind of man Millhaven had always had. Loud, locally significant, convinced that his family name was its own form of currency. His father had owned the gravel pit. His uncle had been on town council for 20 years. Dale himself ran a contracting business that had won every municipal tender in the county for the past decade, always slightly below cost, always with the right handshakes in place beforehand. He came in with 2 men from his crew. They took the large table in the middle of the room. He ordered without looking at the counter staff. He sat down and immediately took up more space than the chair required. He noticed Adele after about 5 minutes. It was her book, later, that she thought was what set him off. Or maybe nothing set him off. Maybe he just needed a direction to point his meanness, and she happened to be in it. "That, the window seat?" he said, loudly enough for the room to hear. Adele looked up. "It is. My crew usually sits there." She looked at the table of 4 large men he'd come in with, sitting comfortably at the center table. Then she looked back at Dale. "You seem to have found somewhere to sit." Someone near the door suppressed a laugh. That was the wrong thing to happen. Dale stood up. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped at her table and looked down at her the way a man looks at something he's decided to remove. "You're not from here originally, are you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I've lived here for 41 years, Adele said evenly. He picked up her coffee cup, just picked it up, off the table, as if it were his. He looked at it for a moment. Then he tipped it over onto the table. The coffee spread slowly across the surface, soaking into her book, dripping over the edge. The room went absolutely still. Adele did not flinch. She looked at the spreading stain, then up at Dale's face. She was frightened. Her heart was going fast. She could feel it. But she had spent 74 years learning the difference between fear and capitulation. And she was not going to let this man see her capitulate. "I think you should leave," she said quietly. "I think you should leave," Dale said. "Matter of fact, I think you should tell your boy to stop making noise about the Bayview Road properties. Word gets around, nobody's interested in his complaints." And there it was. This wasn't random. Cole had been asking questions about the waterfront rezoning. A developer from Kingston had been buying up properties along the lake. Always through shell companies, always at below-market prices. 3 families had sold under circumstances that hadn't felt entirely voluntary. Cole had filed a formal information request with the municipal office 2 weeks ago. It had apparently reached the wrong ears. Adele started to rise. She was calm. She was going to pick up what remained of her dignity and walk to the door. Dale put his hand on her shoulder and pushed her back down. The room made a sound. A collective intake of breath, a chair scraping back somewhere, a coffee cup set down too hard. Petra, behind the counter, had already reached for her phone. The bell above the door rang. Cole Mercer was 38 years old and looked like a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that stillness was more efficient than motion. He was average height, lean, wearing a gray flannel jacket and work boots. Nothing about his appearance announced anything. He carried a simple leather leash. At the end of it, Kodiak moved with him in perfect, unhurried sync. Black and tan, ears up, 100 pounds of absolute attention. Cole's eyes crossed the room in under 2 seconds. He saw his mother's face. He saw the coffee on the table. He saw Dale's hand still resting on her shoulder. He said very quietly, "Kodiak, watch." That was all. Kodiak did not bark. He did not lunge. He moved, smoothly, without urgency, like water finding its level, and placed himself between Dale Fitch and Adele Mercer. He sat, his eyes fixed on Dale with the kind of focus that has nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with certainty. Dale's hand came off Adele's shoulder. Cole walked to his mother. He knelt down beside her chair. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady, just startled. He helped her to her feet. He checked her face, her hands, her posture, the way a man checks a perimeter, efficiently without panic. He saw the red on her wrist where the coffee had splashed. Then he stood up and turned to face Dale Fitch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet in the room was so complete that a normal speaking voice carried to every corner. "You put your hands on my mother," he said. Dale, who had not moved since Kodiak materialized in front of him, found some remnant of his bravado. "Who the hell are you?" "Her son." Cole looked at him for a moment. "That's enough for you to know." From a booth near the back, a man in his late 50s slowly set down his newspaper. This was Don Haskell, the Millhaven chief of municipal police, in plain clothes, having his morning coffee on his day off. He had a face like a man who'd seen most things and had long since stopped being surprised by them. He'd watched Fitch's performance with the particular weariness of someone who knows exactly what he's watching and has learned to calculate when to intervene. He'd been about to stand up when the door opened. Now he watched the newcomer with careful attention. Don got up from his booth. He moved toward the center of the room, unhurried. "All right," he said. "Let's everybody take a breath." Cole looked at him. He didn't know Don yet, didn't know the badge, didn't know the history. He just saw a middle-aged man trying to manage the situation. "That man assaulted my mother," Cole said, "in front of approximately 20 witnesses. Now look," Dale started. "I wasn't talking to you," Cole said, without looking at him. Don stopped. He looked at this quiet, composed stranger, at the dog sitting motionless between the stranger's mother and Dale Fitch, and at the faces of the people in the room. Faces that were no longer afraid, but watching, waiting. "What's your name, son?" Dawn asked. "Cole Mercer. That's my mother, Adele. She lives on Bayview Road." This man deliberately spilled hot coffee on her and then physically prevented her from leaving. Dawn looked at Dale. Dale's jaw was working, but no words were coming out. "Petra," Dawn said to the girl behind the counter, "you have a record of what happened here this morning?" Petra held up her phone. "Video," she said. Start to finish, something shifted in Dale Fitch's face, the specific expression of a man who has just understood the difference between a situation he controls and a situation he doesn't. Dawn turned back to Cole. "I'm going to need statements from you and your mother, and from anyone else who saw what happened." He looked around the room. Several hands went up, quietly, without drama. Cole put his arm around Adele's shoulders. He guided her toward the door. As they passed the counter, he caught Petra's eye and gave her a small nod. She straightened slightly, the way people do when they're recognized. Outside, the morning was cool and bright. Cole settled Adele into the passenger seat of his truck. Kodiak climbed into the back. Cole stood at the hood for a moment, looking at the flat, familiar shape of Main Street. Then he took out his phone, not the regular one. The second one, matte black, heavier, with a different operating system. He pressed a contact that had no name, just a set of numbers. The call connected on the first ring. "This is Mercer," he said. His voice was level, calm. The voice of someone filing a report, not someone who had just watched his mother get pushed down in a coffee shop. "I need to flag a possible connection between local pressure tactics and a federal land acquisition investigation. Millhaven, Ontario. The target is waterfront property on Bayview Road. The developer appears to be using municipal contractors and at least one local political connection to coerce sellers. I have civilian video evidence of a physical assault on a family member. I'm requesting a coordination check with RCMP Financial Crimes." He paused. "Yes, I'll forward what I have." He ended the call. There are moments when a stone falls into water and the ripple is invisible at first, a slight disturbance, barely worth noting. And then, slowly, it reaches the shore. Back inside the Tim Hortons, Petra had already sent the video to two people, Dawn Haskell and her older sister in Ottawa who worked in journalism. Within the hour, the clip was on social media. Within 3 hours, it had been picked up by a regional news outlet. By that evening, it was on Twitter, "Millhaven Assault, who is Dale Fitch?" And below that, quickly connecting, "Fitch Contracting, Municipal Tenders, Bayview Waterfront Holdings, LLC." The name behind the LLC, obscured by 2 layers of incorporation, was a developer from Kingston named Stuart Boyle. Stuart was 55, expensively dressed, and the kind of man who made his money by understanding which local officials were willing to be understood. He had built 4 waterfront resorts in Ontario over the past 15 years. Each time, he had used the same pattern: identify a desirable lakefront corridor, cultivate a municipal ally to facilitate rezoning, and apply escalating pressure on holdout property owners until they sold. In Millhaven, his municipal ally was the Reeve, a man named Victor Crow. Victor was 60 years old, broad-faced, silver-haired, and had served on Millhaven's Township Council for 12 years. He had a reputation for quiet competence and a talent for making difficult things look routine. He had shepherded the waterfront rezoning amendment through 3 committee meetings and 2 public consultations, without it ever generating significant opposition. The opposition, where it existed, had been managed. Dale Fitch was the management. Victor watched the video from his office in the township hall. He watched it twice. Then he called Stuart Boyle. "We have a problem," Victor said. "I've seen it," Stuart said. "Who's the son working on that? Work faster." "That file he requested from the municipal office hasn't been processed. It's been delayed. Delay it further." Stuart's voice was flat and precise, the voice of a man pricing a problem. "And deal with Fitch. He's an idiot and now he's a liability. Distance yourself." Victor hung up. He sat for a moment behind his large, tidy desk, looking at the framed photo of the lake on his wall, the same lake whose shoreline he had been quietly selling off in parcels for 2 years. He told himself, as he always did, that this was simply how development worked. That lakefront properties increased in value for everyone, that the families who'd sold had received fair offers. Even if those offers had come after some unpleasantness, he was not a cruel man. He had simply made a series of pragmatic decisions that, taken together, amounted to something he preferred not to look at directly. He picked up the phone and called his deputy. "Find out who Cole Mercer is," he said. They found out by that evening. The information arrived in Victor's email from a contact in municipal records who had no business accessing federal personnel files but did anyway. The summary was 3 lines. Active duty, Navy, special operations. Victor read it 3 times. Then he poured himself a drink. Meanwhile, in a house on the south side of town, a woman named Sylvie Crow sat in her kitchen and watched the video on her laptop. Sylvie was Victor's wife. She was 57, a retired school principal, and she had spent the better part of a decade slowly coming to understand that the man she had married was not the man she had thought she was marrying. She watched Adele Mercer's face in the video, the elderly woman, perfectly composed, looking at the coffee spreading across the table with an expression that was not defeat, but something more precise. Dignity under pressure. The decision, visible in real time, not to break. Sylvie had made the opposite decision, many times, over many years. She had looked away. She had told herself it wasn't her business. She had been quiet at dinners when the conversation moved into territory she didn't want to examine. She wasn't going to be quiet now. She went to the study. She sat down at the computer. She opened the folder she had created 3 years ago and added to methodically ever since, dates, amounts, names, documents photographed carefully on her phone, and saved to a drive that was not the household drive, on an account that was not a household account. She had not known, at first, why she was keeping records. She knew now. She copied the folder to a USB drive. She put the drive in the inside pocket of her winter coat. Then she called her daughter in Toronto, Manon, 32, a paralegal who had always known more about her father's business than she was supposed to, and said, "I need to talk to you about something. Can you drive up tomorrow?" Cole spent the evening on the porch with Kodiak. Adele sat inside, reading. A new book, because the other one was ruined. She had not, to Cole's knowledge, mentioned the coffee shop incident once since they got home. She had made dinner. She had asked him about his work without asking about the classified parts. She had told him a story about a loon she'd seen on the lake that morning before all of it, and how it had dived and not come up for so long she'd been sure it was gone, and then there it was, 40 meters from where it went under. That's how she processed things. He had learned that from watching her his entire life. He sat in the dark with his encrypted phone and a list of contacts and worked through the problem the way he'd been trained. Methodically, without rage, without impatience. He called his NCIS liaison in Halifax and gave a full situation report. He called a former colleague who now worked in RCMP intelligence and asked a favor. He pulled up everything publicly available about Bayview Waterfront Holdings LLC and started mapping the corporate structure, which unraveled quickly once you knew where to pull. 3 days later, a black SUV with federal plates parked on Main Street. Then another. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. The lead investigator was a woman named Inspector Margot Ossie from the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team. She was 44, Ghanaian-Canadian, with a reputation for methodical dismantling of financial structures that relied on local officials to stay invisible. She had worked 3 similar cases in the previous 5 years. She recognized the pattern immediately. She met Cole at the lake house on a Tuesday morning. Kodiak was on the porch when she saw him, not from fear, but from recognition. "Military K-9?" she said. "Retired," Cole said. She looked at the dog for another moment, then at Cole. Your mother is all right. She's fine. She's at her book club. Something in Margot's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the edge of one. Good. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. Tell me what you found. He told her everything. She listened without interrupting, making notes that were efficient and orderly. When he finished, she turned the laptop toward him so he could see the preliminary case map her team had constructed, the corporate structure of Bayview Waterfront Holdings, the money flows, the timeline of the rezoning amendment, overlaid with the timeline of the property sales. The three families who sold, Cole said. Their properties. That's part of what we're looking at, Margot said. They need to be able to buy them back. She looked at him. That will depend on the prosecution and what assets are available for recovery. But yes, that's on the table. He nodded. He looked at the map on her screen. How long? Weeks, not months. We have what we need. We just need to build it properly so it holds. What the investigation was not expecting was Sylvie. Manon drove up from Toronto on the Wednesday. She sat with her mother at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Then she called a lawyer. Then she called the RCMP tip line, not knowing that the RCMP was already in town, and left a message that was so specific and so organized that the duty officer flagged it immediately and escalated it to Margot's team within the hour. When Margot's investigators went to meet Sylvie, they found a woman who had been preparing for exactly this conversation for 3 years. The USB drive had everything. Emails between Victor and Stuart with subject lines like timeline for remaining acquisitions and pressure on Mercer property. Bank transfer records. A recording made on Sylvie's phone during an argument she and Victor had in the kitchen 18 months ago, in which he had said, plainly and without apparent conscience, that the Langford family on Bayview Road would come around or find themselves dealing with something worse than a bylaw notice. The Langfords had sold the following month. Margot sat in the temporary office the RCMP had established in the Township Hall, the same building where Victor had his office, 2 floors up, and read through Sylvie's documentation for 4 hours. Then she went upstairs and arrested Victor Crow at his desk. He looked, when the handcuffs went on, like a man who had already been somewhere else for a long time and had simply been waiting for his body to follow. Stuart Boyle was arrested in Kingston the same afternoon at a restaurant where he was having lunch with an architect. He argued with the arresting officers for approximately 90 seconds before his lawyer, appearing as if from nowhere, placed a hand on his arm and said quietly, "Stop talking." Dale Fitch was arrested at his gravel pit on the Friday morning. He was the only one who cried. The video of his arrest, taken by a teenager on a bike who happened to be passing, got 400,000 views by the end of the weekend. There are things that take a long time to repair and things that repair themselves. Communities are usually both at once. Millhaven in the weeks after the arrests was a strange, raw place. People talked about it in the way you talk about a storm that's passed. Carefully, with a sideways look at the sky. The temporary manager appointed by the province was a calm, no-nonsense woman named Anara Gill, who had the specific skill set of someone dropped into situations where trust had been stripped down to the foundation. She called a public meeting 2 weeks after the arrests and spent 2 hours listening before she said a word. Petra was called by the Tim Hortons regional manager and offered a shift supervisor position. She took it. The offer came with a quiet acknowledgement from the manager that her actions on that Tuesday morning had probably saved the company from a much worse news cycle. Petra appreciated the honesty more than the promotion. The 3 families from Bayview Road, the Langfords, the Beaumonts, and an elderly couple named the Siasaya Youngs who had lived on the lake for 30 years, were contacted by the federal prosecutor's office about the asset recovery process. It would take time, but the properties were frozen. No one else would be buying or building on that land until the courts decided otherwise. Cole stayed in Millhaven for the rest of his leave. He fixed 3 things on the porch that had needed fixing since the spring. He took Kodiak out to the lake every morning, and the dog would stand at the water's edge with his ears up, just watching, like he was on duty in the most peaceful theater imaginable. On the last Thursday of October, Adele organized a small dinner. It was not a celebration, exactly. She was too practical for that. But she called Petra, and Don Haskell, and Sylvie and Manon, and Anara Gill, and a few others who had been part of what happened, and she made a pot of her late husband's chili recipe and put out good bread, and let people sit where they wanted. Sylvie arrived early and stood at the window looking at the lake for a long time before anyone spoke to her. When Adele approached, she said, without turning, "I should have done this years ago." "Yes," Adele said, simply, without cruelty. "But you did it." Sylvie turned to look at her, this quiet old woman who had refused to be moved by a man who had wanted to move her, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, something like solid ground. At the end of the evening, after the dishes were done and the guests were filtering out into the cold October night, Adele sat on the porch with Cole. Kodiak lay at her feet, heavy and warm against her ankles. The lake was black and still. The stars over it were extraordinary, the way they are when there's no light pollution and the air is clean. "You know," Adele said after a while, "when that man walked over to my table, I was afraid." "I know," Cole said. "Not of him exactly." She thought about it. "Of the room, of everyone looking at me and looking away." Cole was quiet for a moment. "People look away because they think they're alone," he said. "They don't know if anyone else is going to move." Adele considered this. "You moved." "You moved first," he said. "You stood up." "I just walked through the door." She looked at the water. Kodiak shifted against her feet, settled deeper. Somewhere out on the lake, something surfaced and was gone. A fish, or a loon, or just the night moving. "I'm glad you came home," she said. "I'm always coming home," Cole said. The stars stayed out for a long time after that. Long past when the two of them had gone inside. Long past when the lights of the house went off one by one. Kodiak lay on the porch for another hour in the cold, watching the tree line with his quiet, professional attention, ears turning at small sounds on. A branch, a wind off water, a distant car on the highway, before he too was satisfied that everything was all right. And he came inside, and the night settled down around Millhaven, like a hand laid gently over something that was finally, slowly, beginning to heal. If this story stayed with you, if you saw something in Adele's quiet refusal to be moved, in Sylvie's long overdue act of courage, in the way a community found its footing again after being hollowed out from the inside, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. This is what we believe, here, that decency is not weakness, that the people who protect others are not always the loudest ones in the room, that it is never too late to do the right thing, even when the right thing costs you everything you thought you had built. If you believe that too, let us know with an amen in the comments. Subscribe to Seal Dog Saga for more stories that honor the quiet ones who stand firm when it matters. We'll see you in the next one.